So this evening I'm going to read from Storm Story, a cautionary tale. And this is part 5 of a reading that I'm doing of my Christmas gift from my friend Tim Holmes. And so one of the big things I want to talk about is who will come to your funeral and what will they say about you? And I'm reminded of the speech that begins the movie Patton, in which George C. Scott recites the speech that Patton gave to the Third Army before commencing his attack across Europe to end the Third Reich. And one of the things he said is, so what will you say to your grandson when he's sitting on your knee? When he asks you, and what did you do in the Great World War II, Grandpa? Well, you won't have to say, well, I shoveled shit in Louisiana. And so this, since about 85% of my following here are young men between ages 18 and 44, I want to emphasize that it's in this life that you have to make your accomplishments. And you can't wait around for somebody else to do it for you. You've got to do it. And so what I'm reading is eulogies of 3 congressmen, which were contained in the congressional record. Maybe if this will work this time. No, still faking me out. Okay, which are included in the congressional record. And so these are things that other men said about 3 individuals, 3 congressmen, after their deaths. And it's intended to be a cautionary tale and also give you a sense of the type of things that you'd like to have somebody say about you during your life, at your funeral, let's say. So I'm reading the eulogies of Charles Quincy Tyrrell, and the one I'm going to read tonight is the address from Mr. O'Connell of Massachusetts. Mr. Speaker, once again the 61st Congress is called upon to pay honor to the memory of representative in this House from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The loss of 2 congressmen within a year brings us rather abruptly to the fullest realization of the uncertainty of this life. The death of Mr. Lovering, who represented the 14th District, left a big gap in the Massachusetts delegation. For as the Nestor of this group of men, with his years of practical wisdom and wide experience, he greatly strengthened and dignified the position of the Old Bay State in this council chamber of the nation. Mr. Lovering's death was comparatively sudden, although his advanced years might have justified a fear that his remaining years might be few. But the unlooked-for summons of Mr. Tyrrell was a real shock, taking him from us, as it did, in the fullness of his matured wisdom and years, when we all felt that there were yet before him many years of honor and important advanced work. His loss to Massachusetts was acknowledged on all sides by the sincere evidence of sorrow everywhere displayed in his district when it became known that he had passed away. We mourn him as a colleague, but I also mourn him as a friend. He was a man who won my respect and confidence, merited, I believe, to the fullest degree. Mr. Tyrrell was my senior by many years, and when I came to the bar in Boston to practice law, he was then one of the best known trial lawyers. and engaged in a very large practice. Among his best clients was a large corporation, much of the business of which was with small contractors and builders. Some of these were careless and improvident, and among them, one who became a client of mine. A dispute arose between my client and that of Mr. Tyrrell. The directors of the corporation were men of very little sentiment and were accustomed to exacting their pound of flesh regardless of consequences. It seemed to me that my client was right, although from the standpoint of the corporation, he had no rights at all. Long litigation would be necessary before my client could prevail, entailing large expenditures for experts and the cost of the protracted hearings. This naturally left him at a tremendous disadvantage, for his wealth consisted practically of a very large family, all of tender years. Good ethics and morals, aside from the equity of the question involved, convinced me that the corporation would do a grievous wrong in resisting my client's claims. I called upon Mr. Tyrrell and discussed the question with frankness. My appeal to him for simple justice impressed him, and in a few days, he wrote me stating that his clients had accepted my view and a speedy settlement followed. Now, the reason I'm having trouble reading this is because my friend Tim has used the book for drawings, and his charcoal is sometimes a little bit dark, and it's hard to read the words through his dark drawing, but nonetheless, it's the collection of Tim's drawings and these eulogies and my reading it to you that represents a new work of art. This in itself was commendable, but of course, not altogether extraordinary. But when I ascertained some months later that Mr. Tyrrell had been unanimously overruled by the directors of the client, who insisted on taking advantage of the policy or might overwrite to defeat the ends of justice, despite Mr. Tyrrell's advice, only to be told by him that he would no longer represent them if they pursued such tactics. Then, indeed, did my admiration for the man assert itself. And for 11 years since that time, I have continued to honor and respect him as a lawyer, a gentleman, and a high public official. Further, I believe it was such sterling characteristics that endeared him to many friends in all ranks of life, who knew him and who became his loyal, steadfast supporters in public life. Like his colleague, Mr. Levering, he had differed with the leaders of the Republican Party in Massachusetts on matters of policy and party action. This aroused angry feelings on the part of powerful interests in his district, who would have retired Mr. Tyrrell to private life to replace him with someone who would bow the supple knee to them and their wishes. But the people of this district knew him best and continued him here in Congress for 6 terms. His splendid courage and indefatigable efforts on behalf of his district combined to make this possible. But inasmuch as his successor to fill the unexpired term is a Democrat, as his successor to fill the unexpired term is a Democrat, and his successor elected as a Republican by less than 100 votes, we are forced to the conclusion that our late colleague was a man who had peculiarly won his way into the hearts of his constituents to a remarkable degree. Massachusetts has always applauded courage and personal independence, and we may easily believe it was Mr. Tyrrell's enemies in high political circles caused by his courageous independence that made him so powerful with the voters of the 4th District. A rather strange coincidence is noticeable in connection with the political situation in the districts represented by our late colleagues, Mr. Levering and Mr. Terrell. Both were men of mature years. Both came to Congress after brief service in the Massachusetts Senate. Both were schooled in the world of business. Mr. Levering as a cotton manufacturer, Mr. Terrell in connection with wood pulp and banking interests, which engaged his attention besides the law. Both differed with their party leaders and were constantly harassed for this reason, but in each case, their districts stood solidly behind them. Both represented supposedly Republican strongholds, yet each was succeeded by a Democrat. Mr. Foss, a Democrat, succeeded Mr. Levering, while Mr. Mitchell, a Democrat, succeeded Mr. Terrell. And to make the coincidence stronger, we find a Republican successor to Mr. Foss by only 41 votes, while the Republican successor to Mr. Mitchell wins by less than 100 votes. This striking difference in the vote for our late colleagues and their successors illustrates more strongly than words can tell the splendid opinion entertained of both Mr. Levering and Mr. Terrell by those who knew them best. No Democrat had ever succeeded in defeating either, and a majority of thousands successively re-elected each of them. Mr. Terrell had won his spurs as a lawyer before the most exacting bar in the country, that is, the Boston Bar. He understood men in a remarkable degree, not in any sense magnetic, denied those physical attributes which often attract a following to a man in public life. Rather small in stature, he nevertheless enjoyed the warm affection of a multitude of friends, chiefly, I believe, because of his deep understanding of his fellow men's ideas, hopes, and thoughts. No man can attain high office in our large fraternal organizations unless he clearly comprehends and practices the cardinal virtues on which these great orders are built and organized. His high rank in the Independent Order of Oddfellows, as past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge, at once carries conviction that he was a man among men, honored and respected in a large field where fickle public opinion and unreasoning public passion play no part. His ripe experience in law and business, amplified and completed by his activity in the fraternal society life of his country, stamped Mr. Terrell as one decidedly fit and equipped to enter duties as a member of Congress from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It is needless to refer to the industry, care, thought, and indefatigable work which he brought to his official position in this great body. His district was regarded and cared for with a zeal and thoroughness that won respect and gratitude from men of both political parties in all the cities and towns of the district. Massachusetts and the ideals of her people had in Charles Quincy Terrell a representative worthy of her best traditions and highest aspirations. She always demands honest progressive legislation. He labored honestly and well in private and public life. His years were filled with industry and intelligent effort. He enjoyed his work and labored well to bring forth the best that was possible. How apt it is at this time, in connection with his sincere purposes and life attainments, to recall the beautiful thought of Kipling an author of whom he was very fond. Quote, "When Earth's last picture is painted and the tubes are twisted and dried, when the oldest colors are faded and the youngest critic has died, we shall rest and faith we shall need it, lie down for an eon or two, till the master of all good workmen shall put us to work anew. And those who are good shall be happy. They shall sit in a golden chair. They shall splash at a 10-league canvas with brushes of comets' hair. They shall find real saints to draw from, Magdalene, Peter, and Paul. They shall work for an age at a sitting and never be tired at all. And only the master shall praise us, and only the master shall blame. And no one shall work for money, and no one shall work for fame. And each for the joy of working, and each in his separate sphere, shall draw the thing as he sees it, for the God of things as they are." Okay, so that completes the eulogy of Mr. O'Connell. I will proceed further on another occasion, probably tomorrow, with the address of Mr. Tillman of Connecticut. And so I've been reading from Storm Stories, a cautionary tale by Tim Holmes and various and sundry other authors, and read to you by Skip Conover. And so thank you for joining me this evening, and God bless the United States of America. And I'm wearing my purple shirt today in honor of the inauguration of President Biden, and the hope that we Americans can build bridges between us so that we don't fall off one side or the other.